Imagine standing on the shores of Portsmouth on a summer-s day in 1545. The salty wind whips against your face, carrying with it the cries of gulls circling overhead. The sea is restless, but the harbor is alive with excitement, for this is not an ordinary day. This is a day when England's greatest warship, the Mary Rose, will once again show her strength. The Mary Rose wasn't just any ship. She was the pride of King Henry VIII, a symbol of England's naval power at a time when kings measured their worth not only by crowns and castles, but by the size of their fleets. For Henry, who had broken from the Catholic Church and declared himself the head of the Church of England, every display of power mattered, and nothing showed might quite like a massive, towering warship bristling with cannons. But to understand why the sinking of the Mary Rose became one of the greatest tragedies in English history, we must first understand where she came from. The birth of a warship, the Mary Rose, was built in 1510, early in Henry's reign. He had inherited a small but decent fleet from his father, Henry VII, yet he had bigger dreams. Europe in the 1500s was a dangerous chessboard. France was powerful, Spain was ambitious, and the Pope himself wielded influence like a king. Henry knew that if he wanted to stand tall among them, he needed a navy that could inspire fear. The Mary Rose was part of this dream. She was large for her time, around 500 tons, when first built hand-carried dozens of guns. But she wasn't only a floating fortress. She was also a symbol of national pride. She was named, historians believe, after Henry's sister Mary Tudor and the Virgin Mary, blending family devotion with religious imagery. When she first sailed, the Mary Rose represented innovation. Unlike older ships that had relied heavily on boarding tactics, where sailors literally leaped onto enemy decks to fight hand-to-hand, the Mary Rose was designed to use heavy artillery. Cannons lined her sides, ready to blast through enemy hulls from a distance. In many ways, she was ahead of her time, one of the first true gunships of Europe. War with France? For decades, the Mary Rose served Henry well. She fought in battles against the French and was part of campaigns that shaped the early 1500s. The English and French were locked in a bitter rivalry, one that stretched back to the 100 Years' War. Each side sought dominance not only on land, but also on the seas. By the 1540s, that rivalry burned hotter than ever. France, under King Francis I, had become a formidable power. The French navy was strong, and their armies vast. England, though smaller, had something to prove. Henry VIII, older now but still fiery in spirit, wanted glory. He wanted to show Europe that England could not only defend itself, but strike fear into its enemies. In 1545, the French launched a massive invasion fleet, perhaps 30,000 men strong, sailing across the Channel. Their goal? To crush Henry's navy and land on English soil. If they succeeded, England itself could fall into French hands. Henry gathered his forces at Portsmouth. His fleet was smaller, but he had confidence. And among his ships, none inspired more pride or more faith than the Mary Rose. A summer day in Portsmouth, the morning of July 19, 1545, began like any other. The sun rose over the Solent, the stretch of water between Portsmouth and the Isle of Wight. English soldiers, sailors, and townsfolk gathered on the shore. The harbor was alive with energy. Drums beat, flags snapped in the wind, and men prepared for war. The Mary Rose was anchored proudly in the harbor. She had been refitted over the years, expanded to carry even more guns by now, over 90 pieces of artillery. She bristled with power, a floating castle of oak and iron. Her crew was massive, nearly 500 men, a mix of sailors, soldiers, and gunners. Some were seasoned veterans, others were fresh recruits, nervous but eager. Among them were archers with longbows, gunners with heavy cannon, carpenters, cooks, and surgeons. Life aboard a Tudor warship was crowded, smelly, and dangerous. But for many of these men, serving on the Mary Rose was a source of pride. They were defending England itself. From the shore, King Henry VIII himself watched the preparations. He was a larger-than-life figure by then, stout, commanding, dressed in rich clothes despite the summer heat. Beside him were nobles, courtiers, and townsfolk, all eager to see the great battle unfold. The calm before the storm, the French fleet had appeared, their sails blotting out the horizon. Dozens upon dozens of ships stretched across the water, carrying soldiers, cannons, and supplies. They were an intimidating sight, a wall of power moving slowly toward England's shores. But the English fleet was ready. Smaller, yes, but battle-hardened. The Mary Rose and her sister ship, the Great Harry, stood at the center of the defense. Around them clustered smaller galleys and support ships. For hours, the two sides eyed each other. The sea was restless, the wind shifting. The English waited for the right moment, the right wind, to unleash their power. Tension hung in the air like smoke before a fire. On board the Mary Rose, the crew went about their work. Gunners checked powder and shot. Soldiers sharpened weapons. Officers shouted orders, their voices carrying across the decks. Below, in the cramped gun decks, men sweated in the heat, surrounded by iron and oak, knowing that soon they would face death or glory. Above them, the masts creaked, sails fluttered, and the ship swayed gently on the water. Some men prayed quietly, others joked, hiding their fear behind laughter. War was coming. The fatal moment approaches by late afternoon. The wind shifted. This was the moment the English had been waiting for. Drums beat. Trumpets sounded. Orders rang out. The Mary Rose, towering and majestic, began to move forward. She turned toward the French. Her gun ports open, her cannons ready. From the shore, Henry and his courtiers leaned forward, eager to see his great warship strike. And then disaster. As the Mary Rose turned, she suddenly lurched. To the horror of all who watched, she heeled sharply to one side. Water rushed in through her open gun ports. Within moments, the ship that had been the pride of England was sinking before their very eyes. The horror of the sinking, panic erupted. On deck, men scrambled desperately. Some clung to rigging, others leaped into the sea. Shouts and screams filled the air, mingling with the crash of waves and the groan of timbers breaking apart. From the shore, the spectators were stunned. Henry himself, it is said, watched helplessly as his beloved ship went down. In mere minutes, the Mary Rose vanished beneath the waves, her masts protruding briefly before slipping into the depths. Out of nearly 500 men aboard, only about 30 survived. The rest, sailors, soldiers, officers, were trapped inside, drowned in darkness. The pride of England was gone, and the reasons why would haunt generations. The image of the Mary Rose slipping beneath the waters of the Solent must have been burned into the memory of everyone who saw it that day. Imagine the scene. One moment, a towering fortress of timber and cannon, surging proudly toward the French fleet. And the next, a sudden lurch, a spray of seawater, and then a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. What made it all the more horrifying was the speed. Ships often took hours to sink, giving crewmen a chance to abandon ship, to swim, to cling to wreckage. But the Mary Rose, she was gone in minutes. The panic on board on the decks, chaos ruled. As the ship keeled over, men were thrown off balance. Cannons broke free from their moorings, crushing anyone in their path. Barrels rolled, ropes snapped, timbers groaned. The gun ports, which had been opened to fire at the French, now became gaping holes through which the sea poured with relentless force. Imagine being one of the gunners below deck. You're standing in the stifling darkness, sweating from the heat of the cannons, ears ringing from the blasts. Suddenly, the floor beneath you tilts violently. Water rushes in, cold and merciless. Darkness thickens as the lanterns are extinguished. You claw at ladders, at hatchways, but the passages are already clogged with men. Screams echo, mingling with the roar of the sea. For many, there was no escape. The lower decks of Tudor warships were death traps. Once water entered, narrow stairways, locked hatches, and panicked crowds meant that men were trapped like rats in a flooding cellar. Above, some leaped into the sea, but most Tudor sailors weren't strong swimmers. In fact, many feared the water more than the enemy's swords. Weighted down by armor, weapons, or heavy clothing, they sank quickly. Only a handful managed to cling to floating debris or rigging until rescuers reached them. Out of nearly 500 men, fewer than 40 would live to tell the tale. Theories of the sinking from the very moment the Mary Rose went down, people asked the same question. What? How could England's most powerful warship vanish so suddenly, in front of the king himself? Over the centuries, countless theories have been proposed. Too many guns, too much weight. The Mary Rose had been refitted several times during her career. Originally built to carry around 70 guns, she had been expanded to hold over 90 by 1545. This made her a powerhouse, but it also made her dangerously unstable. Some historians argue that the sheer weight of her artillery made her heavy, and as she turned sharply in the wind, she simply tipped over. Open gun ports. This is the most widely accepted theory. When preparing to fire, the Mary Rose's gun ports were opened just above the waterline. If the ship leaned too far, water would rush inside. That's exactly what happened on July 19, 1545. The ship turned. The wind caught her sails awkwardly, and seawater flooded in faster than the crew could react. Within moments, it was too late. Crew inexperience. Another possibility lies not in the ship, but in the men. Some accounts suggest that many of the Mary Rose's crew were newly recruited, untrained in the complex teamwork required to handle a massive warship. Inexperienced sailors may have failed to manage the sails properly during her maneuver, causing her to heel too far. French attack for years. Some believed that the French had struck a deadly blow, a well-aimed cannonball perhaps, or a devastating broadside, but no such evidence was ever found. Survivor accounts and later archaeological evidence showed no signs of battle damage. The French didn't sink the Mary Rose, she sank herself. A combination of factors? Most likely, it wasn't just one reason. The Mary Rose was overloaded, maneuvering sharply, her gun ports open, and her crew under pressure. A perfect storm of design flaws, human error, and bad luck sent her to the bottom. The survivors' voices. What about the men who lived? Their voices are faint echoes across time, but they give us glimpses into that terrible day. A Flemish survivor later recalled how the ship turned on one side and suddenly sank. He described the water rushing in so quickly that in a moment, she was gone. Another account came from Sir George Carew, the admiral commanding the Mary Rose. He was seen waving his hand through the stern windows as the ship went down. His desperate gesture was the last anyone saw of him. He went down with his ship, along with hundreds of others. The few who survived were pulled from the water by smaller English boats. Some clung to floating timbers. Others barely managed to keep their heads above water. Each man who made it back alive must have carried the trauma of that day for the rest of his life. Shock and silence on shore. Imagine the horror of those watching from Portsmouth. Families, wives and children had gathered to see the fleet sail. King Henry himself was there, his vantage point giving him an unbroken view of the disaster. For a king, obsessed with control, with power, with the image of strength, the sight of his prized ship sinking beneath his very eyes must have been shattering. But if Henry wept, he did so in private. Tudor kings did not show weakness. Publicly, he shifted his focus back to the looming French threat. But privately, the Mary Rose's loss must have gnawed at him like a wound that would never heal. In Portsmouth, grief settled like a fog. Hundreds of families waited for news of their loved ones. Few names appeared on the survivor lists. For most, the answer was silence. Fathers, brothers, sons gone, drowned in the murky waters of the Solent. Attempts at recovery almost immediately. Divers were sent to the wreck, not scuba divers of course, but men who used crude equipment-weighted ropes, barrels for air, and incredible courage. These Tudor divers managed to retrieve some guns, anchors, and rigging from the wreck, but most of the ship remained buried. The Mary Rose lay silently beneath the waves, her masts sticking up briefly before rotting away. Over the decades, storms covered her with silt, preserving her like a time capsule. Too many, she became more than a shipwreck, she became a ghost. Fishermen spoke of snagging their nets on her remains. Sailors whispered of her as a cursed reminder of England's vulnerability. The aftermath for England, the sinking of the Mary Rose, was more than just the loss of a ship. It was a blow to morale. The French fleet still threatened, though the English ultimately held them back. The loss of such a powerful vessel in the middle of battle was humiliating. Henry VIII carried the sting of that day with him for the rest of his reign. He continued to build ships. Of course, he was the father of the English Navy, after all, but the Mary Rose was never forgotten. She was both his pride and his failure. For the families left behind, life went on, but scars remained. Whole communities had lost fathers and sons. Portsmouth, the city built on the work of sailors, shipwrights, and dockworkers, felt the tragedy deeply, and the sea kept it secret. For more than 4 centuries, the Mary Rose lay hidden in the mud, waiting to rise again. For centuries, the Mary Rose slept beneath the waters of the Solent. She lay hidden in darkness, preserved by layers of silt and sand. Her timbers, her cannons, even the personal belongings of her crew all sealed in a watery tomb. Generations came and went, but the ghost of the Mary Rose was never entirely forgotten. Fishermen told stories of their nets snagging on something massive below. Divers in the 19th century stumbled across timbers, sometimes pulling up artifacts, yet the ship herself refused to give up her secrets. It wasn't until the 20th century that technology, determination, and passion combined to bring the Mary Rose back to light. The story begins in the 1960s, when Alexander McKee, a historian and diver, became fascinated with the mystery of the Mary Rose. Many knew she had sunk in 1545, but her exact location was uncertain. Some believed she had been destroyed by time, scattered by the sea, but McKee thought otherwise. In 1965, he began Project Solent ships, gathering volunteers, divers, and historians to search for Tudor wrecks in the Solent. Their greatest prize, of course, would be the Mary Rose. For years, progress was slow. The waters were murky, visibility often reduced to just inches, yet the divers persisted. In 1971, their patience was rewarded. Using sonar technology, they discovered strange shapes buried beneath the seabed. And then came the breakthrough. Timbers, centuries old, unmistakably from a Tudor warship, the Mary Rose had been found. Imagine being one of those divers, brushing away centuries of silt and seeing the wood of a ship that lasts. Sailed in the days of Henry VIII, it was like touching time itself. As the excavation began, objects emerged, astonishingly preserved. Cannons with the Tudor Rose engraved on them. Longbows stacked like firewood, still intact after 400 years. Wooden dishes with the initials of their owners carved into them. Leather shoes, delicate combs, and even musical instruments. Most haunting of all were the remains of the crew. Skulls, bones, teeth, all silent witnesses to the tragedy of 1545. Each skeleton told a story. The archer with enlarged shoulders from years of drawing a bow. The cook with traces of arthritis from endless hours at sea. The young boy barely into his teens who had gone to war and never returned. For the first time, archaeologists weren't just studying a ship. They were studying the lives of the very men who had sailed and died aboard her. But finding the Mary Rose was just the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead. Could she be raised from the seabed after more than 4 centuries? The task was monumental. The surviving portion of the ship was fragile, half-buried, and waterlogged. Any mistake could shatter her into pieces, but the dream was too powerful to abandon. For more than a decade, teams of archaeologists, engineers, and divers worked tirelessly to plan the raising. Then, On October 11, 1982, history was made. Millions watched live on television as the remains of the Mary Rose were carefully lifted from the seabed. A massive floating crane, the tugboat, was used. Divers worked in dangerous conditions to secure the fragile hull, and finally, slowly, she broke the surface, emerging into the daylight for the first time in 437 years. It was a moment of pure triumph. Crowds cheered. Archaeologists wept. The ghost of Henry VIII's warship had risen again. Once raised, the Mary Rose was moved into a specially built conservation facility in Portsmouth, not far from where she had been built and launched centuries before. Conserving a Tudor warship was no simple task. Her timbers, soaked in seawater for centuries, were fragile. If left too dry too quickly, they would crumble. For decades, she was sprayed with a fine mist of water, and later, with a wax-like substance called polyethylene glycol, which replaced the water in her timbers and kept them stable. Visitors who came to Portsmouth in the 1980s and 1990s remember seeing the Mary Rose behind a curtain of mist, a ghostly shape slowly being preserved. It wasn't until 2016 that she was fully revealed in a state-of-the-art museum, where visitors could see her up close without barriers. What makes the Mary Rose extraordinary is not just the ship herself, but what was found inside. Over 19,000 artifacts were recovered, offering an unparalleled glimpse into Tudor life. Weapons, dozens of cannons, from massive bronze guns to small handguns, showing the transition from medieval to modern warfare. Hundreds of longbows, some 6 feet tall, with arrows tipped in deadly iron. These were the last great longbows of England, silent witnesses to a fading tradition of archery. Everyday items, wooden bowls, spoons, leather shoes and combs. These simple objects tell us about the daily lives of the crew, from what they ate to how they groomed themselves. Medical tools, a surgeon's chest was found, filled with instruments for treating wounds, bone saws, syringes, ointments. It paints a vivid picture of how Tudor medicine struggled to keep pace with the brutality of war. Personal touches, carved dice and gaming pieces, musical instruments like a sham, a kind of early oboe, and even a small dog's skeleton, believed to have been the ship's radar. These details remind us that the crew were not just soldiers, but men who laughed, played, and lived ordinary lives before their tragic end. Each artifact is a voice from the past, speaking across 5 centuries. The Mary Rose is more than just a shipwreck. She is a time capsule. No other Tudor vessel has survived in such detail, and no other wreck tells us so much about the people of the age. Through her, we see the dawn of modern naval warfare. We understand how Henry VIII's navy functioned, how sailors lived and died, and how England's dream of maritime power was born. We also see the human cost of that dream. The remains of the crewmen from across England and beyond remind us that history is not just about kings and battles, but about ordinary people swept up in extraordinary events. The Mary Rose also changed archaeology itself. Her excavation and raising were among the most ambitious underwater projects ever attempted. The lessons learned have shaped how we preserve and study shipwrecks around the world. Today, the Mary Rose rests in her museum in Portsmouth Historic Dockyard. Visitors walk alongside her preserved hull, peering into her decks. Clever displays project holograms of the crew, bringing the ghostly timbers to life with the faces of the men who once served there. For those who stand before her, the experience is profound. You are not just looking at wood and iron, you are standing in the presence of history. You can almost hear the creak of ropes, the thunder of cannons, the shouts of sailors. And you can feel the weight of tragedy, the knowledge that hundreds of men never returned home. The story of the Mary Rose is at its heart a human story. It is about ambition and innovation, pride and tragedy, loss and rediscovery. It is about how a king's dream turned into a nation's heartbreak, and how centuries later, that heartbreak became a bridge to the past. In many ways, the Mary Rose's sinking was symbolic of Henry VIII's reign itself. Grand, powerful, ambitious but also flawed, unstable, and doomed to fall under the weight of its own contradictions. Yet unlike Henry, the Mary Rose has found redemption. Her resurrection has given her a second life, not as a warship, but as a teacher, a storyteller, a reminder of who we were and how far we have come. When visitors leave the Mary Rose Museum, many do so in silence. Not because there is nothing to say, but because words often fail in the face of something so deeply human. The Mary Rose no longer sails the seas. She no longer fires cannons in defense of her king, but she still has power. The power to move us. The power to connect us with the lives of those who came before. And perhaps, if you stand quietly enough by her preserved timbers, you might just hear the whispers of that summer's day in 1545, the rush of the tide, the cries of men, and the last breath of England's lost ship.